So welcome everyone to another session, this time the seventh talk of the Living Memory of Cities series. First, before we start, I would like to ask everyone to switch off cameras and mics should you not wish to be recorded. You can still be part of the proceedings, of course. As I was saying, it's the seventh talk, the end of this first series, and the second series is already prepared, and it will be announced shortly. Everyone is invited. Our hope is that we will have as many talks as possible. It's one of the great advantages of this format. Today we have Philip Christou, who is honoring us with his presence. Philip will be talking about the poetic transformations of topography. So I'm very curious on a personal level to hear him talk. Eric Parry will be chairing this session as always. After that, first brief introduction. Philip should talk for about half an hour or so in all freedom, and that will be followed by the usual period of 30 minutes of questions and answers. There will be questions just within the time available. Everyone is very welcome. Matthew, I think, would probably have a question already in mind, but in any case, I'll leave that to him. And over to you, Matthew, for any notices and a welcome on the part of London Met.
Yes, well, I won't say very much except on behalf of London Metropolitan University and the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies. We are very thrilled to be at the tail end of this first series that we've been co-producing with our collaborators, Eric Parry Architects, who in fact initiated the idea. We're really happy to have some fairly firm plans in place for our second series, which will run next academic year, and we are hoping to lead towards a conference or a symposium which is likely to take place next summer. We're still in the kind of planning stages of that, working again with Eric, and we're looking to announce that formally fairly soon. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Eric, who will say a couple of words, and then Philip can start.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Just to add a very personal note, to say how much I have enjoyed a kind of sharing of an academic and a practice orbit with Philip and obviously his long-standing partner, Florian. In as much as I found myself in spaces that they've designed quite brilliantly, the masters of the collective space and landscape, you know, from the Half Moon through Spring House, through the brilliant work at the CAS, and many lectures. And the one unfulfilled delight I have is a visit to Seoul and South Korea, where obviously their brilliant work has been a very positive contribution to, you know, an international profile. So looking forward to this hugely, and with great respect. Over to you, Philip.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Matthew and Nicholas and Eric, José, and everyone for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to do this, and it's a great honor. I'll just share my screen and let's get started. If I can. Okay. Can everybody see that?
That's great, Philip. It's working perfectly.
Okay. In the past, the qualities of place in towns, cities, and landscapes evolved in a seemingly natural way as a result of local traditions, craftsmanship, and a close connection to regional and local climate and topography. These places are easily understandable to us for their beauty and sense of belonging. These qualities are very difficult to design on a drawing board. They are the result of a responsive, adaptive, and slow-moving building process. Our time has very different conditions and expectations of living to those of a vernacular village. However, I think there are ways that we as architects can think and work that have a strong sense of time, with the knowledge and responsiveness to the inherent and potential beauty of a local context. In this lecture, I will attempt to retrace the path that has been taken by a few architects in contemporary architectural projects that can be described as topographical and perhaps poetic. These projects are demonstrations of ways of designing that are responsive to the collective memory of the site. They have a sense of time that is found in the place and can be projected into the future. I would suggest that the proliferation of undifferentiated and seemingly uncontrollable urban sprawl that we are experiencing in most regions of the world today can be understood to be caused by a loss of sense of time and memory of place, what I could call a topographical amnesia. The well-known and much-loved early projects designed by Alvaro Siza are clear examples, in my opinion, of a topographic, highly sensitive, site-specific architecture. Kenneth Frampton wrote in 1986 about the work of Siza. He makes us aware that any construction is both topographically and temporally predetermined, and that all we can do is to modify the fabric of the moment as it lies suspended between one historical instant and the next. Both the swimming pool at the Quinta de Conceição from 1958 to 65 and the pool at Leche de Palmeira 61 to 66 near Matosinhos, where Siza was born, are eloquent essays in the integration and coexistence of the human-made with the natural characteristics of the land. The artificial interventions make the pre-existing geological and urban character more visible, more understandable. The new building fabric does not imitate the form or shape of the topography or the existing natural context. The poetry resides in the dialogue between them, each informing and living from the other. Careful judgments are made in deciding how much and how little to build. The building form is guided by the inherent morphology of the physical and spatial characteristics of the site as the architect sees them. The long, parallel concrete walls of various heights at Leche de Palmeira, some retaining, others defining straight edges to horizontal floors, intensify and articulate the long, horizontal nature of the site as an embankment to a coastal road. Siza, writing about the project many years later, writes, quotes, "The idea of my project was to optimize the conditions created by nature, which itself had already begun to design its own pool. I thought it necessary to take advantage of the same rocks and restrict the use of walls to an absolute minimum to complete the containment of water. Thus, a far closer connection was established between the natural and built environment. However, as a result of prior experience, what came to be built was defined in a far clearer and autonomous manner." I think he's referring to the Boa Nova restaurant, which he thinks that the pool is even clearer. An architecture of long lines and long walls seeking an encounter with the rocks in the right place. The aim was to outline a geometry on that organic image, to discover what was available and ready to receive geometricity." End of quotes. Similarly, at the Quinta de Conceição, long retaining walls and stairways, ledges, and long straight enclosing walls that merge and connect with the buildings and platforms of the pool all combine to form an artificial acropolis-like ensemble of spaces at the top of a hill with natural vegetation. This is not an attempt to hide the building into the ground. It is the inverse of this, is a cultivation of the site. The buildings are not standalone objects in the landscape. They are part of a topographical ordering of the site that extends across and into the land. Siza goes on in another text, quotes, "A site is valued for what it is and for what it can or wanted to be. Two things which are perhaps opposite, but never unrelated." It is likely that few who have had the opportunity to experience visiting these places will disagree that a poetic transformation of the given topographies have been made here. However, is it possible to delve a little deeper and inquire about what we mean by poetic and the word topography? And how does a talented and sensitive architect such as Siza decide the limits of reinterpretation, intervention, and proposed change to a given site? How much is necessary and proper to do, and when is it too much? In any architectural design project, be it at the scale of an interior of a dwelling, a building in a dense city context, or a proposal for a new urban district to be built within a landscape of farm fields, for example, it is inevitable that elements and forms of intervention will be imported from elsewhere. Images and ideas that are dissimilar and uncommon to the existing situation will be introduced. Topography, as it is typically understood, is the shape and form of the land or ground, or the floor that we walk on. The word derives from the Greek topographia, which is composed of topos, or place, and graphia, which means writing or drawing. The topography is the shape and form of a place as we understand it graphically. Siza's geometricity can be seen as a form of writing into the place, making it more discernible, understandable, and visible to people. I will return to this discussion about topography later, with a slightly broader definition that encompasses geographical sites of many scales, including domestic interiors, and considering cultural and political situations as topographies as well. Let me first speculate, however, on what might we consider to be poetry, and where might this reside in the architectural experience. The etymological derivation of the word poetry is complex, but gives us a few clues. The word poet comes from the Greek poetes, and this is thought to derive from poein, meaning to make. A poetess is a maker, producer, author, a doer, or performer. In ancient and medieval times in Europe and throughout the Mediterranean regions, poets were traveling singers, actors, and performers who were retelling stories in song, dance, and rhyme. The word poesis from the ancient Greek is the activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. However, as we know, not all things that are made can be considered poetry. If I make a loaf of bread, or a house, or if I make my bed, each of these things can be done with passion, care, and a certain creativity. But it is seldom that these everyday things that we make are poetic. It seems to me that a poetic experience happens when we are, perhaps only for an instant, transported beyond the free and everyday bodily material existence of worldly things to a place where imagination never has to give way to the conditions and limits of life as we know it. In Plato's Symposium, Diotima describes how mortals strive for immortality in relation to poesis. In the bringing forth upon the beautiful, there is a kind of making, creating, or poesis. In the Genesis, there is a movement beyond the temporal cycle of birth and decay. In the Timaeus, Plato regards physis, or the principle of growth and change in nature, as the result of poesis. However, Aristotle considers poesis as an imitation of physis. So whether poesis or poetry is the human ability to affect growth and change in nature in an attempt to attain a godlike state of immortality, or it is an attempt to imitate the complexity and unattainable beauty of nature that is the creation of God, and or those forces and powers that are completely beyond human comprehension. It is something to do with transcendence or detachment from the bodily conditions of the world we live in. Martin Heidegger refers to physis as a bringing forth, as emergence, using this term in its widest sense. He explained poesis as the blooming of the blossom, the coming out of a butterfly from a cocoon, the plummeting of a waterfall when the snow begins to melt. These are threshold conditions, a moment of ecstasy, trance, or rapture, when something moves away from its standing as one thing and becomes something else. In the spring of 2017, Florian Begel and I organized a lecture series at the London Metropolitan University titled The Poetic Dimension in Architecture, asking each lecturer to try to discuss this question in their own work. We found this wonderful quote from Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's book, What is Philosophy?, and put it on the poster. In a violently poetic text, D.H. Lawrence describes what produces poetry. People are constantly putting up an umbrella that shelters them, and on the underside of which they draw a firmament and write their conventions and opinions. But poets, artists, make a slit in the umbrella. They tear open the firmament itself to let in a bit of free and windy chaos, and to frame in a sudden light a vision that appears through the rent. Wordsworth's Spring, Cézanne's Apple, the silhouettes of Macbeth or Ahab. Art indeed struggles with chaos, but it does so in order to bring forth a vision that illuminates it for an instant, a sensation. Art is not chaos, but a composition of chaos that yields the vision or sensation, so that it constitutes, as Joyce says, a chaosmos, a composed chaos, neither foreseen nor preconceived. I love this quote as it seems to get to the heart of the matter in all its slippery and irrational aspects. Shakespeare expressed something similar in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives them to airy nothing, a local habitation and a name. This painting by Marcel Duchamp, titled Tu me, made in 1918, was the last painting on canvas he ever did in his career. As I listened to a lecture by Laura Hardy at the symposium organized by the KU Leuven last November, I was reminded about Duchamp's enigmatic, mischievous, and playful ways when speculating on the fourth dimension, or what he referred to sometimes as n+1 dimensional. Although it is often commonly assumed that the fourth dimension is the same as time, Duchamp doesn't seem to necessarily think about it this way. Craig Adcock explains the way Duchamp took conceptual models from scientific sources in the early years of the 20th century to suit his artistic purposes. Quotes, Duchamp's notes are masterpieces of humor and innovation, and they should be considered a major work in their own right. The ironic mock seriousness of the notes is one of their greatest charms. It was through this mock seriousness, or as he called it, an irony of affirmation, whose differences from negative irony depended solely on laughter, that Duchamp explored the frontiers of creative endeavor, end of quotes. In the painting Tu me, Duchamp traced the shadows of two of his ready-mades, the bicycle wheel from 1913 on the left end of the painting, and the hat rack from 1917 on the right end, with the shadow of another everyday object not assigned as a ready-made, a corkscrew. On the bottom left corner, the wooden shapes of the three standard stoppages and some curved lines drawn on the right side of the painting that look like the curves taken from the stoppages superimposed over the shadow of the hat rack. In this detail of the right end of the painting, you can see these curved lines of the stoppages at their left ends are extending from the corners of a thin, transparent, foggy, rectangular plane drawn in perspective here. And a number of lines of colors, something like the codes of color spectrum that one gets when analyzing material with a spectrometer by passing light through a gas and then splitting the light into its various wavelengths with a prism. Here, these lines. These are also drawn in perspective, joining the curves to the shapes of the shadow of the hat rack. The thin, transparent, foggy, rectangular plane seems to be the last, and here's what the spectrometer might looks like. The thin, transparent, foggy, rectangular plane seems to be the last of a series of planes of various colors. Here, this one is the series of planes here, drawn in perspective, going to infinity towards the top left corner of the painting. In between, near the center of the painting, is a tear in the canvas held together with safety pins, like a rent or a bolt of lightning, an actual three-dimensional void that connects the shadows of the corkscrew and the hat rack, and separates the thin rectangular plane connected to the curves on the right with a line of colored planes on the left. A three-dimensional wire bottle cleaner emerges from this tear in the canvas and projects outward from the painting, also projecting an actual shadow depending on the lighting in the room. Duchamp had a sign painter draw a hand pointing to this bottle cleaner or its shadow here. Laura Hardy suggests that the long line of transparent colored planes are like an infinite array of overlapping tracing papers. An English translation of this note, one of the notes that Duchamp made concerning his interest in the fourth dimension, might read something like this. The cast shadow by a figure in fourth dimensions, or our space is a shadow in 3 dimensions. 3-dimensional sections of 4-dimensional figures in a space, analogous with the process of architects who describe the plan of each of the floors of a house. A 4-dimensional figure can be described for each of its floors by 3-dimensional sections. These different floors will be connected each to each by the 4th dimension. Construct all the 3-dimensional states of 4-dimensional figure by determining all the planes or faces of a 3-dimensional figure. In an interview with the French art critic Pierre Cabanne in 1966, Duchamp explained this a little bit more clearly. Quotes, simply I thought of the idea of a projection of an invisible 4th dimension, something you couldn't see with your eyes. Since I found that one could make a cast shadow from a 3-dimensional thing, any object whatsoever, just as the projecting of the sun on the earth makes 2 dimensions, I thought by simple intellectual analogy, the 4th dimension could project from an object of 3 dimensions. Or put in another way, any 3-dimensional object which we see dispassionately is a projection of something 4-dimensional, something we're not familiar with. It was a bit of a sophism, but it was possible. The bride in the large glass was based on this, as if it were the projection of a 4-dimensional object. This reminded me of a previous lecture in the Symposium given by Paolo Providencia, where he traced the design process of the School of Architecture building in Porto by Siza. The various plan drawings of the project drawn on tracing papers, developing and uncovering the directionality and geometries of new routes, retaining walls and buildings in relation to the former agricultural retaining walls and landforms of the existing site overlooking the Douro River Valley, seemed to me to rhyme with this metaphor that Duchamp has imagined when he says the different floors will be connected each to each by the 4th dimension. Seen this way, the past natural and human formations of the site, combined with the evolution of possibilities as design development drawings, is a continuum. So the solidification of the architecture school buildings into built form seems to us to be a final solution, but of course is merely a moment in the process of life and change on that site. Apart from this temporal sense of continuity made by the parallel relationships between the given topographical and spatial site conditions with the imagined future transformation of them, it seems to me Duchamp, in his what he calls physique amusante, or playful or amusing physics, elicits a special kind of a poetic experience in the flip-flop nature from 2 to 3 to 4 dimensions and back again. He is searching for the horizons or hinge points that might be between these dimensions. One cannot avoid, oh, there's the quote, I'm sorry. One cannot avoid being reminded of Duchamp's enigmatic found object, the door of his former studio at 11 Rue Lowry in New York from 1927 that opens as it closes. This hinging effect is played out in full narrative effect in the large glass from 2015 to 23, where the lower male bachelor's region of the glass is separated with a horizon or hinge to the upper female bride region of the glass. Duchamp reminds us again of the quote of D.H. Lawrence that I made earlier. Quotes, but poets, artists make a slit in the umbrella, they tear open the firmament itself to let in a bit of free and windy chaos and to frame in a sudden light a vision that appears through the rent. Let us now return to the question of topography that I introduced in a general way at the outset of this talk, and consider a little about this idea of transformation. The Osterkirkegarden, or the Malmo Eastern Cemetery, is located on a site east of Malmo city centre. In 1916, Sigurd Leverance won the competition to design a new cemetery there. The city was expanding eastward, and the cemetery was an important element of the new city district being planned at the time. The Scania Landscape in southwestern Sweden is a gently undulating terrain, very flat and open. However, unique to the given site of the cemetery was the presence of a long ridge, the Högasassen, I suppose you pronounce it, running in a southwest-northeast direction pointing towards the city centre to the west. This has been a popular place for Malmo residents to go for Sunday walks, as a wide view over the surrounding landscape was possible. Leverance made a number of design plan options for the cemetery layout between 1916 and 1928, some with more regular grids of fields and others more irregular, always maintaining the ridge as a starting point and principal ordering device. A main avenue running along the southern side of the ridge is also a constant in each plan, this main avenue here, and the ridge is along here. With various ways of organizing these lanes and burial fields to the south and north of the ridge. Leverance heightens the given landform of the ridge by flattening the top of the ridge into sloping plains that rise and fall along the length of the ridge. These are left as enigmatic, open, empty fields, seemingly waiting for people to be buried there, but meant to be left empty. The edges of these fields have sharply engineered embankments that mark the horizon of the ridge as an artificial structure of straight lines and edges, and they partially contain the open fields. An ancient Bronze Age burial mound covered with trees is located along the ridge next to one of these fields. David Leatherbarrow discusses the idea of topography as the landform as well as the spirit of the humanity and lives that have been acted out there, invisible yet present, as what he calls a recessive horizon. I quote, "Topography is a name for a network of contemporary performances that weave into a one fabric the action of a people and its history, a network enmeshed within a range of sites that it shows are really very much like one another, similar but not the same. The task of the architectural work is to set up the conditions under which the recessive horizon can articulate itself." The architectural intervention here is extremely subtle, yet very powerful. There are no standing tombs or gravestone monuments. Organization of the various fields of burial places are built with a vegetal architecture. Each lane in the cemetery urbanity is articulated with a different order of trees or hedges. Although the cemetery is quite large, one has no difficulty in orientating oneself here. Each small field of graves has a different identity and order. It must be very easy to remember where to find the grave of a loved one here. The territorial boundaries made with these lines of vegetation have a variety of densities and heights, ranging from very low 10 or 20 centimeter high hedges defining small fields, to 3-meter high wall-like hedges enclosing larger landscape rooms, acting like delicate curtains in the wintertime, as seen in these photos, to large lines of trees along the southern boundary of the cemetery, providing a transparent screen to the landscape beyond, yet clearly delimiting the larger space of the cemetery. This vegetal architecture has been maintained with immaculate precision and care since it was first planted in the 1920s. The density of this lovingly maintained city of the dead, formed by this complex lattice of vegetal architecture, powerfully contrasts with the timelessness and emptiness of the artificially transformed ridge. Leverance described the architectural intention of the design of the Eastern Cemetery as follows, quotes, "The facility has been arranged in such a way that it highlights the ridge that runs through areas which is generally left untouched, only increased by ramparts which limit the high-lying burial grounds. Even when the cemetery has been fully developed, the image typical of a Scania landscape will be maintained, a gently undulating terrain that reaches the horizon, a landscape that lightens and liberates." End of quotes. Now I'd like to just run through some of these transparent layers of a design that Florian and I made about 20 years ago in London in an apartment, and to just review how this might play out in interior topography. The site that was given this looked something like this when we arrived. It's about a 22-meter long, maybe 9-meter wide loft space in central London, and it has these large rectangular columns and beam structure marching down the center of the space. We transformed it into something that looked like something like this, with a set of large pieces of furniture that are loosely arranged between these columns. When we started, we tried to think about what could be done amongst these kind of elephantine kind of columns and this long space, and we thought perhaps it could be some kind of landscape of different levels and terraces or something. The client was interested in that. But bit by bit, we came to the idea of what Florian called a floating order, where elements would find their way in this space, but the overall space of the room is left complete, and the ceiling is complete, and the floor is continuous. So we, in this little sketch of Florian's, you can see that these things are on wheels, imagined to be, furniture that could move around. It's something like this, where the barges docked along the edges of the River Po are find their place amongst the static edges of the river, or in this fantastic cistern in Istanbul, these giant columns are standing in a lake, and one could imagine boats moored up to them. So this series of elements went through a number of iterations and movements, and they finally kind of coalesced into something of this order, where in fact there's also a large grand piano and there's some bigger piece of furniture the client has, and this is a tiny little closet for the double bed, so that the compression of this space makes the largeness of the other space even more perceivable. And this is a kind of sketches of that. And even the lamps are an array of plant-like structures in the coffers of the ceilings that are free and continuous through the whole space. So the plan ended up like this. These are now all fixed elements, but they are somehow moored up against almost touching these columns in a almost difficult way. This is a fixed table that is cut out to engage with this column. So in the end, this top of this body is not exact, is sloping down slightly to this end that increases the perspective. You can't imperceptibly. And then we try to keep the existing concrete ceiling and beams and columns and the existing walls we painted in one color, and the floor in another color, and most of these elements are made out of this laminated wood. And then there's a series of screens that are sliding screens along the wall. Okay, I'd like to end with this quote, this wonderful quote from Aldo Rossi from the Scientific Autobiography. "We could speak about every project as if it were an unfinished love affair. It is most beautiful before it ends. And for every authentic artist, this means the desire to remake, not in order to effect some change, which is the mark of a superficial people, but out of a strange profundity of feelings for things, in order to see what action develops in the same context, or how, conversely, the context makes slight alterations in the action. Certainly, there is always a different object when you remake. This is perhaps what is autobiographical in a building and what I like to see in architecture, but also in the abandonment of architecture. For a past without the desire for the present is sad. As I've said, forgetting architecture comes to mind as a more appropriate title for this book, since while I may talk about a school, a cemetery, a theater, it is more correct to say that I talk about life, death, imagination. Thank you very much. I'll stop presenting and...
Yeah. Thank you so much. Can we turn to questions? And I think Matthew is first up, please.
Yes, thank you. Of course, thank you very much for that, Philip. It's really terrific. It felt also that you were addressing, perhaps for many of us, well, we were returning to some of the fundamental questions that resonate for all of us, but that have also been central to what we've been addressing in this conversation, in this series. Not only this year, but also the predecessor conversations at different times and places, including some of the sessions we had at Eric's office, beforehand, but also very nicely to David Leatherbarrow's talk in November, which kickstarted this current series. But I just wanted to take another moment to bring something up that you started with today. And it seems to me there's something really strong that has critical purchase in a phrase that was embedded in the passage that you cited from Kenneth Frampton in his essay on the work of Alvaro Siza. So Frampton said, and I've just pulled up the quote again, he makes us aware that any construction is both topographically and temporally predetermined, and that all we can do is modify the fabric of the moment as it lies suspended between one historical instant and the next. And I find this quote very helpful. Obviously, it brings to mind this dialogue between place and time, but this particular phrase within it, the fabric of the moment, I think is incredibly instructive with regard to obviously the work that you've showed us to consider, but also you showed us one project of yours with Florian, which is the apartment in Clerkenwell. And I'm also just wondering about, more broadly, with your approach and this idea about the poetic, poetic dimension of creativity, which is also about the interaction between time and place, what it might mean. So, I mean, I was just interested to talk a little bit more about the idea of its character as fabric. We're very familiar with the metaphor of fabric, whether we're talking about a stitch in time or knitting the urban fabric, whatever it may be, and fabric that can be patched or repaired. But as I said, I think it resonates in the work, in your work with Florian, also with regard to the idea of craft and being involved in making something. Thinking through other projects such as the interior at Central House, but also with the ideas about landscape infrastructure that you've developed, and also your students, Paul, Lucy, other students are developing in some of their work. And you presented some of this around the idea of landscape infrastructure in a talk that you gave with Paul and Lucy at the Wash Houses a couple of years ago. And it is in regard to these elements that I'm just wondering, is this idea of the carpet, the mat, the idea of the fabric of the moment, something that you could develop in relation to maybe, say, Mangum or some of these other projects of yours? So perhaps a little bit garbled, but I was just thinking through this idea about the fabric of the moment and how it's very strong, but it can, when you talk about it specifically with regard to the Clerkenwell project, it seems to me that it's something that we could discuss further.
Right. So, you know, the idea of infrastructure is one of the, you could say, devices, or even it's maybe even, you could even think of it like a metaphor, really, that we use to try to get our heads around how to deal with a long duration of time from the past and an uncertain future on a site. And so we thought that perhaps there are different temporalities that can be understood in a site, some more long term and some more short term, and the infrastructure would be the longer term forms on the site that one could work with, that would inform the shorter term things that life on the site. And but that is that was only one way of thinking about time, and I don't think it's necessarily the only way. And you asked a question about the fabric of the moment, as Frampton calls it. I mean, idea of urban fabric or a woven, for example, this weaving that's behind me is, I think, in many cultures in the world, the weaving of not only pattern but of the weft, and it is a metaphor for many things, but for society or for a history. There's a narrative in a weaving, or there's many messages, and for example, I think about this one that's behind me as I think it's from the Sahara. We bought it in Morocco, but it's I think it's from the desert, and I assume, and it was probably used, by people that were nomadic in the desert. But I think also of it as a map of the desert, or it could even be seen like I don't know if you can see it, but that it has a kind of notation like a musical notation, where there's some figures that are repeated, but they're not. There's not a regular pattern, and it's not unlike the music that one hears in for example in the mountains of Morocco. I don't know, which is anyway. And so I think the metaphor of fabric is really useful because it is rich with, dense with interconnectedness and interwoven stories. I don't know if that helps with. I didn't. If I answered your question or not.
Have you got further comment, Matthew, or
well,
we ask the question?
I think perhaps what I was also what was also very interesting to me was this idea of that space in between something that is found and something that is created, which you spoke about very nicely with regard to this idea of the kind of floating world. But I can see other people have got their hands up, so maybe we should go on to other questions.
Well, let's move to Christian, if we might.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really interesting. I was sort of drawn to the sort of the aspects of Siza's work that seems to me always are interested in a tension between the early vernacular work he did with Tavora in understanding sort of Portuguese architecture in relation to its topography and its activity and the activities surrounding it, and the relationship of the architecture as form, if you like. And I think equally we see this in the Leverance example you talked about in Malmo, where it seems to me there's a tension between, in all of these that the architect is playing, between the ceremonial landscape and the vernacular landscape, and the way in which these two things can be played often against each other, but they have necessarily differing, often differing motives behind both their use and their representation. And I'm just wondering whether in that sort of discussion, the relation between poetics differs between an understanding of poetic making and poetic experience, insofar as one can, as a maker in the notion of poesis, engage in certain aspects of making very specifically, but also perhaps in the act of observing or participating also have a slightly different sense. And I was just intrigued into that, because vernacular doesn't necessarily often have poetics at its heart, and yet can become a part of a tension within the creative landscape, I suppose, of thought. So just sort of interested in maybe unpicking a little bit more, separating landscape as form from sort of vernacular and poetic, and just thinking a little bit more about what you think about that.
Well, you know, one thing that I really wanted to put into this lecture, which I wasn't able to, mostly because of, it would have made it a much longer talk, but I would like to discuss this outside of the Western tradition of, like, you know, Greco-Roman remit. And, you know, for example, what does all this mean to a Aborigine in Australia, or the Plains First Nations person in the plains of America? You know, for example, to nomadic people who don't build anything permanent, their buildings are temporary and movable, and they don't make fences and territories, and, you know. However, I would argue that they are making poetry, and it's in, and I suppose what you've asked is, I think it's in their interpretation of the landscape, and the spirit of the landscape, and their understanding of it is poetic. So it's not in the making, it's not in the craft necessarily of the, you know, their buildings or their, you know, it might be, but it's not as we see it. I think it would be more in their in the way that they see and understand the landscape as on the one hand, very, very earthly and physical and real, and on the other hand, something well beyond that. I guess you could call it spiritual, or you know, and in the some mix between those. I think that's why I brought in Duchamp, because he's somehow the schism between the real and the three-dimensional and what he calls the four-dimensional, or the n+1. It's the somewhere that hinge between what we think of as spiritual or otherworldly and the real worldly, you know, the three-dimensional physical, you know. And by using the, you know, the craftsman, when it's perhaps very done with poetry, the making of something, is where they take, in my opinion anyway, where they are able to take the material. Let's say a potter is making a pot on the wheel, and there's the physical nature of the clay and the water and so on that they're working with, and absolutely sensitive to the physical qualities of that material, yeah, and their body and their senses and so on. It's I don't know if you've ever made a pot, but it's very you can't do it if you have a hangover, you know. But when it turns into something beautiful, that's such a pot, it's when it somehow transcends all that physicality. Yeah, it starts from that, and it is that, and through that it becomes something, you know, like when the pot, the Korean ones that were made, that were in the 16th century, that were like intentionally almost falling over, you know, like almost molten. Yeah, they're very, very free, and the brush strokes similarly on them are like that. They're at the limit of being a mess, like of being chaos, you know, of losing it from this control of the craft, you know. And at that point is where a spark happens, you know, like something really magic happens, and it's, you know, that's the poetry as far as I'm concerned, you know.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Let's turn to Maurice, if we might.
Yeah, sure. So Phil, thanks for the talk. It was it got my mind to thinking quite a lot, and it's lovely to see you. So my question is about the title of the talk. I'm very interested in this idea of topography and amnesia, because, as you know, we've been working in Freetown in Sierra Leone for a long time, and I feel there it's a very dramatic landscape. It's a big peninsula next to the sea with very rushing streams rather than big rivers, with a coastline and a forest line which is moving backwards and forwards, and steep contours. So those are the sort of lines we have, and the population, I find, is wanting to forget topography and its effect on the immediate placemaking. In the same way that people, they would want to forget the bad things like slavery, like the mudslide, like flooding of the rivers when people die. They would prefer something to move on. You know, they do reject remembering. You know, a lot of Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the Civil War found that people didn't want to remember the horrid things that had happened. They wanted to build a school that was new and modern, you know.
Yeah.
However, what I find is that there are still remnants of, I suppose you'd call it magic, but they have an idea of the witch city, for example, where you could go and you could make £1 million or you could die. It's difficult to know. It's chaotic in those terms. And if you go too far to the junction from your village, people might come out of the forest, small white men, Portuguese, the original slavers, and come and take you away. So the memories are not good, if you see what I mean. However, occasionally you find they take little bits of the landscape and use it as a memory board. So that tree reminds me of that person, or that stone reminds me of this, and they put together a poem, if you like, or at least a construction of their memories in the garden or in the back of their house. And so what I'm trying to do in architectural response to what we're looking at is to try and have a different view of the topography so that they can connect and find out its affordance, its opportunities, and make that connection. So it's less perhaps at the scale of the small building, and more against all my previous experience. I'm starting to look at a wider scale, despite my cynicism of planning. I'm having to look at this wider scale to try and get them try and get the population to engage with this sort of wider landscape, which is so dramatic and so full of potential. And does that accord with your idea of topographical amnesia, or how can you just say a little bit more about what you mean by topographical amnesia and see if I can link the two? Well,
I don't. Is there also a typical kind of sprawl happening there?
You can't sprawl because it's so steep. You know, what you get is you get informal stuff going up the hillside, built individually. You call it a slum, but it's not necessarily so. Yeah. And it's illegal, and it just goes on. So there are certain patterns involved related to the topography, but it's never seen. So the bits that are not built by you don't see it as a public infrastructure, like a pathway or a set of steps going up the hill, which we would. But get people to see that mark in the landscape as something poetic, or even as something that should be maintained and functioned and is a civic good is difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I like that was interesting that you say that there are some kind of memory devices that people use, like in their garden or something. That kind of that's I think. Inevitably, I don't know, in whatever culture, there's always something that is of value. Yes. You know, whether it's miniature something or at the scale of the landscape, or you know what, yeah. There's value that is given, and of course there's bad memories, as you say, that there's a kind of, you could say, even bad value, or like, you know, a kind of sad values that are given to things too. But there's you know, there's things which people hold dear, isn't it? Like, and it might be the most strangest things, like, you know, maybe a type of something in their cuisine or something, you know, or whatever, yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's important to acknowledge, and I think that's what culture is about, isn't it? It's about acknowledging what we value and handing that on to the next generation type of thing, isn't it? Yeah, and exactly. Language is a big part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And music is, and so on. You know, and all sorts of culture are. So in architecture, I don't think you can force it. You know, I don't. You know, I don't think you can say this must be preserved because I think so. You know, type of thing. However, the architect does have to make that decision. You know, what is of value and what isn't, and it's part of our role, our responsibility. But I think we have to be not be dogmatic about it.
Yeah.
You know.
Sure.
We have to be.
Thank you.
Let's. Could we move to Nicholas? And I'm searching for any other in the short time we have. So please put your hands up, so to speak, if you wish to ask or comment. Thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah, I just like, well, first of all, I just like to say how much I enjoyed your lecture, and it's certainly put some kind of ideas in my own head about topography. I'm interested in the relation between temporality and topography here, and the issue of what constitutes amnesia. The notion of topographical amnesia is actually a really interesting point. I think particularly in the context of when we think about temporality as a means of dialogue, and you described in the context of Siza's work the capacity of his architecture to manifest or facilitate dialogue with its setting, let's say with its natural setting, whether that's to do with using David Leatherbar's concept of recessive horizon, what topography actually means, with the lie of the land, with the sky, with the tree, with the sounds of the winds, whatever it may be, that these kind of background conditions, which actually are enabled by means of topography as the facilitator of a dialogue. And it seems to be interesting in the context of contemporary debates about the very existence of nature itself. In very recent discussions by environmentalists, environmental philosophers, there's a really quite fierce debate about whether in fact there are lots of books about the death of nature or the end of nature. And one of the key arguments about this idea of nature's end is for the simple reason that the very moment that the human built environment operates within the natural landscape, it destroys it, it annuls it, it effectively kills it, and in a way that there are no means to our as architects, as designers, to rethink our relationship with the natural world. Once we establish a kind of architectural language, you know, in the context of the landscape, it seems to me this question of temporality and the capacity of architecture or topography being a means of a dialogue with the natural world is actually really interesting. There is also a very strong view that actually there is no dialogue with nature, by the way, that nature is essentially mute, or we can have a conversation, the idea of what language actually is about dialogue, and yet here you're presenting topography itself as a form of dialogue that transcends all those arguments about muteness and silence, or our division, or the division between the natural world and the human world.
You know, with an interesting thing when looking at Siza's work through his whole career, I think you could practically take any project of his and think about it as topographical, and so even the you know, the single-family houses that are in a suburban situation in Portugal, you know, on a corner or something, he finds a way of understanding the site conditions and making something afresh with it, like, you know, not just lining up with a house next door or something. It's not a kind of mimesis. He he makes use of the conditions of whatever it is. It might be natural, it might be artificial, urban structure, and transforms it into its own, makes a place there, makes a new place there, yeah, or elevates the place to, yeah. And so whether it's relating to natural forces like the sunshine or the wind or the river or artificial context like the street or the urban situation, is both, in my mind, are topography. So natural or artificial, they're both topography. And the natural one is much more complex, much more difficult to understand because it's so complex. Like so, and as you say, it's we're finding ourselves in our age actually working at the scale where it's affecting the overall ecology of the Earth, of the planet. So we're really affecting nature in a big way, as we know. Yeah. So it's and we don't know what, we're out of control. We don't know what to do about it. But I think for me, that's a bigger question about, let's say, ecology but for me, topography is about place. It's about understanding and making it an identifiable place, and this, what I called topographical amnesia, is where when we spread out, sprawl across the landscape and undifferentiated, and and then buildings are left there after they're not used anymore, and the other building, and this is placeless. There's no sense of place, and no sense of time as well as a result. Yeah, both, and they're connected. A sense of time is a good way of making a sense of place, but it's not the only way. Yeah.
Okay. I think that probably, as far as I can see, that is drawing us to a conclusion, and huge thanks to Philip for that really stimulating and haptically rich seminar. So I'd really, first of all, like to thank you, and to, the virtual round of applause. Absolutely, so fantastic, actually. Yeah, and I would also just like to say that out of the ashes of a symposium that was planned and about to happen at the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon some time ago, which involved José and I going to persuade them that this was a good idea. I have to thank massively José de Paiva's kind of dedication to pulling from that very negative situation this series, principally with our friends and colleagues at London Met. That's been fantastic, and it has spanned and kind of really happily disturbed the luxury of silence that has curiously been a fallout of this pandemic. But it has really contributed to a richness when I put all the participants together over the period of time in a really solid way, and a foundation that I believe is now, you know, enthusiastically embraced, and actually means that in October, in that sort of academic cycle, we start again. And actually, it's a curious thing that somehow there is an intimacy in this media that is like the seminar space, but at 100 plus. So it is, to me, you know, a very perplexing condition that we've come to. But anyway, my huge thanks to everyone involved for this series, and really looking forward to the next, which I believe will be opened by Kenneth Frampton in October. I don't know if anyone else wants to add a comment to the organizational sort of sequencing, but otherwise, yeah, as it were, leave, farewell, and see you again, and very soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric, and everyone, and thank you to everybody that came to watch. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Bye bye all.
All right.